I actually started my fun with apologetics 5 or 6 years ago on the AOL discussion boards. I don't know how many of you participated in that. And I have done some stuff on the Fair Message boards, but not too much in the last year or so. I've been involved in a lot of other things which have taken a great deal of my time. And I kind of like to think of myself not so much as going out and finding lots of answers, but I do like to point out what I call stupidity. And sometimes people take offense. So I'm not always wanting to jump in on a discussion and pick a side, but when somebody just comes right out and says something that clearly is to defend it, I like to jump in. What I want to talk about today is some stuff that I've been working on for probably about 2 years now. And it came about in a funny kind of way. My dad and I were discussing some questions that he had about the death of Laban when Nephi kills him. And part of that was also because my mother is a big fan of Rene Girard. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He's a philosopher who gets into a lot of violence and social structures. But my dad was asking me why it was I thought that when Nephi's got the Laban's armor on, goes to pick up a place, nobody ever questions the fact that there probably should be a lot of blood all over him, because he's just had his head chopped off, and then Nephi takes his armor off and puts it on. And so I got to thinking about it, and I came up with just some unique ideas, and this has changed a lot. It probably won't remain the same. In my 50 minutes today, I'm not going to have time to even get close to finishing all of my notes and details. So for those of you who find this interesting, I'm going to put in a plug right now. You want to sign the sheet back there for to receive your copy of the proceedings, because the full paper will be in there. So let me dig in. This is going to be something new maybe for some of you. And if you do have questions, I don't really have a problem with you getting up even in the middle of my presentation and asking them. A lot of times I'm going to make some leaps perhaps that if you can't follow it and you have some questions, just let me know. Now, this is really, this paper is about some of the literary forms in the Book of Mormon and about the Book of Mormon's literature. So I'm going to be talking about it in two perspectives. And I don't want you to take this to say that I don't believe that there isn't a lot of historical detail and fact in the Book of Mormon. What I'm going to tell you is that these facts and stuff are being presented in a very specific way. A number of years ago, over the last, let's say, 20 years, we've had a number of new people writing about the literary aspects of the Book of Mormon. And one of the big things that's been a fun topic to read is this idea that we're seeing all of these very detailed parallels between the Exodus pattern in the Book of Mormon and the Exodus of ancient Israel out of Egypt. And as a base, and I'm not going to get too much into the works, but I'm using as a foundation for this some of the writings of S. Kent Brown, George Tate, Terry Zink, and Noel Reynolds, for those of you who've read some of those. If you haven't, look up some of their essays and stuff on the authorship of the Book of Mormon. They're very fascinating. To begin with, Brown published an article titled The Exodus Pattern of the Book of Mormon, and in it he makes this following comment. He says, "There is no clear statement indicating that the members of Lehi's immediate family understood that their departure from Jerusalem was a reenactment of Israel's fight for freedom. It is necessary, therefore, to sift through the evidence piece by piece." And a little bit later he continues, he says, "It was not Nephi or Jacob, members of Lehi's immediate family, who made this connection explicitly. Instead, it was others who came 500 years later." And I'm not sure whether he still stands with this viewpoint. And I'm certain that he's correct that the Exodus itself that Lehi takes from Jerusalem is not a conscious reenactment. However, I believe that his other assumption is incorrect. And this first part of this paper is going to demonstrate that not only was Nephi aware of the parallels that existed between his Exodus and that of Moses and the Israelites, but that he intentionally patterns his writings on the Old Testament text. And this isn't to say that he makes an explicit reference, because it doesn't, but rather that he expects us as his audience to draw these connections. And part of this is due to the fact of the revelations that he's received about the nature of the Book of Mormon coming forth in the last days. And there can be no doubt that for us to see this connection was in his mind when he wrote it. Tate, similarly, makes the determination that Nephi comes to a realization of the Exodus pattern He wrote this in his article, The Typology of the Exodus Pattern of the Book of Mormon. He wrote, "But at this point, he cannot have known how apt the illusion really is. This is Nephi before he has the text in hand as a means of glossing his experience, before he realizes in what detail his own family will replicate the Exodus. As his awareness grows, he alludes with increasing frequency of the Exodus." And to that I responded by focusing exclusively on these Exodus narratives in the Book of Mormon. Tate leaves behind a number of other indicators which demonstrate conclusively that there is not a growing awareness. In fact, Nephi begins his record by pulling heavily from the Old Testament, as if he is assuming that his work in the Old Testament will be read side by side. And because of this, there are a number of earlier parallels in the Nephi material which Tate does not identify, particularly because they do not deal with the Exodus at all. And once we see them for what they are in this passage, so that Nephi was consistently relying on the brass plates. I also want to make a quick mention of Zink's work. He wrote To the Land of Promise. And it was really one of the first studies on the literary nature of the Book of Mormon that dealt with language as an issue. Particularly, he talks about the use of the term murmuring and how the many times it is used in 1st and 2nd Nephi go back to the way that the Israelites murmured for Moses in traveling from Egypt to their promised land. I've had to make a couple of the same assumptions that Zink makes when he does this. And clearly, my paper here is not extensive enough, large enough in scope to defend these assumptions. And I'll mention this again in just a minute. But, irregardless, Zink adds to this growing evidence of textual reliance. One of the things, though, that he deals with is he speaks a lot of this verse in 1 Nephi, chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. And he does it when he writes this. He says, "The result does not represent a day-to-day or even a year-to-year account, but rather a highlighting of main events with special emphasis on the things of God and desire to persuade men to come to the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob and be saved." One of the things that I'm going to point out is that for Nephi, there is no distinguishment between this concept that Jesus is the Christ and this concept that Nephi is a king and that Lehi is a prophet. All these things are represented the same truth. And so, following Noel Reynolds in his political Nephi, Nephi's text has a number of very political elements and secular elements that don't reflect his ministry at all, but instead deal with these issues of kingship and the right to rule. And he ties those connected in such a way that the gospel then becomes the same message. In fact, Noel Reynolds wrote this. He said, "The two messages of the book are tied in such a way that whoever accepts the teachings of Christ accepts that Nephi was a legitimate ruler, and vice versa. Nephi carefully constructed what he wrote to convince his own later generations that the Lord had selected him over his older brothers to be Lehi's successor. Thus, one interesting way to read the account is as a political tract produced to show that his rule was authoritative. What we tend to read as a story of flight from Jerusalem is really a carefully designed account explaining to successors why the religious faith in Christ and the political tradition, the kingship of Nephi, were both true and legitimate." And I think that some of the ideas I'm going to share today are going to validate Brother Reynolds' approach. Now, before I jump into the text here of the Book of Mormon, I wanted to just go over that one assumption that I mentioned just a minute ago. It is beyond the scope to defend this paper to defend this assumption, although I think that as this growing body of literature develops over the literary nature of the Book of